This last film is about the Soviet Union after Stalin, in the period up until 1964. When he died in March 1953, he didn't leave behind an obvious successor. He hadn't nominated anyone to take over from him, but it was widely assumed that the next leader of the Soviet Union would be a man called Georgy Malenkov. Now, Malenkov was the head of the Soviet government, and everybody expected him to be leader of the country. But he and other leading members of the Politburo, the cabinet, announced that there'd be a collective leadership of the country. And that collective leadership was made up of Malenkov, who, as I said, was the premier, the head of government. There was also Molotov, he was the foreign secretary. Bulganin was the deputy premier and the defense secretary, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was the party secretary. There was also Lavrenti Beria, the head of the MVD, the secret police, which used to be called the NKVD and had infamously carried out the purges under the leadership of Yagoda and Yezhov in the 1930s. For those five men, Malenkov, Molotov, Bulganin, Khrushchev and Beria, they formed a collective leadership in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. They all, Malenkov, Molotov, Bulganin and Khrushchev all feared Beria. They feared his control over the secret police. They feared him because of what he'd done as leader of the secret police. They feared that he knew all their secrets. And so they quickly arranged for him to be removed from power. He was arrested in June 1953. He was accused of being a foreign spy. He was summarily tried and he was executed. So it looked to the rest of the world that even though Stalin was dead, it was the same old Soviet Union, that they were still going to deal with their political enemies in exactly the same way that Stalin had done. However, that was the last time that a political purge within the Bolshevik Party took place. It was the last time that a leading Bolshevik was arrested and executed, and it marked an end of that method of dealing with political opposition in the Soviet Union. However, it didn't mark an end to the internal power struggles within the Bolshevik Party. And to cut a long story short, between 1953 and 1955, there was a struggle for supremacy, political supremacy, between Malenkov, Molotov, Bulganin and Khrushchev. And by 1955, Khrushchev had used his position as secretary of the party to outmaneuver Malenkov, who was his strongest opponent. Malenkov was blamed for various failures of policy up until 1955, and he was forced to resign in 1955. And Malenkov's resignation put Khrushchev in a much stronger position by 1955. Then the following year, in 1956, Khrushchev famously gave a speech at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which had become known as the Secret Speech, which you may well have heard of. In this secret speech, Khrushchev railed against Stalin. He denounced Stalin. He talked about Stalin's crimes. He talked about Stalin's purges against the party in the 1930s. He talked about Stalin's cult of personality. He talked about the errors Stalin had made in foreign policy. And by all accounts, everyone that was in the hall that heard this speech was just incredibly shocked when they heard Khrushchev talking about these crimes of Stalin's, because up until that point, and for the past quarter of a century, Stalin had been portrayed by everyone as basically a godlike genius who could do no wrong. And the country had been completely subservient to Stalin. And all the people in the hall had basically had their careers rested on Stalin's patronage. And here was the new General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, tearing Stalin's reputation apart. It was incredibly shocking. It sent shockwaves throughout the Soviet Union and throughout the world as well, because although it was supposed to be a secret speech at a closed session of the party congress, it was quickly leaked out and read around the world, and it was received around the world as a sign that perhaps the Soviet Union was going to embark on some quite fundamental changes, that perhaps the Soviet Union under the leadership of Khrushchev was going to be a very different kind of country. But it sent so many shockwaves throughout the Soviet Union that it ignited opposition to Khrushchev. And Malenkov, who'd been demoted in 1955 but was still a member of the Politburo, Malenkov conspired with some other Politburo colleagues, notably Lazar Kaganovich and Molotov, and to a lesser extent Bulganin, conspired against Khrushchev to try and get rid of Khrushchev. And they, in a session of the Politburo, they voted for Khrushchev's removal from the post of General Secretary of the party in 1957. But Khrushchev cannily outmaneuvered them. He used his contacts in the army. He had a base of support within the army. He was supported by General Zhukov, who was head of the army, and he flew in using military planes. He flew in supporters to a meeting, a specially convened meeting of the Central Committee of the party, and that special session of the Central Committee of the party overturned the decision of the Politburo to remove Khrushchev. So Khrushchev used his wider contacts within the party to outmaneuver that small group of politicians in the Politburo. And after that, he then denounced Kaganovich, Molotov and Malenkov, and later Bulganin, as an anti-party group, and had them all removed from their positions of power. But unlike in the Stalinist years, when any opposition to the General Secretary was met with certain death, this time the way Khrushchev went about dealing with his political opponents was to demote them and to put them in humiliating jobs. For example, Molotov, who had been the great foreign secretary of the Soviet Union, was made ambassador to Mongolia. Malenkov, who'd been the head of government in the Soviet Union, was sent off to run a hydroelectric power station in Kazakhstan. These were humiliating demotions, and Khrushchev knew it for these people, but they weren't murders, and that marked a change in the political methods used by the leader of the Soviet Union. So, by 1958, Khrushchev was in sole control of the Soviet Union. He took over Bulganin's post of Premier of the Soviet Union, and for the first time since Stalin, one man was both the Premier, the head of government, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and so he held the two most important and powerful positions within the party. But who was this man? He was born in the Ukraine in a peasant community. He became a junior engineer as a young man. He joined the Bolsheviks in the Civil War in 1918, and he became a political commissar for the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he became very active in the Bolshevik Party in the Ukraine and became secretary of the party in several districts of the Ukraine. He was then promoted to a district secretary in Moscow. And in 1935, he became head of the Bolshevik Party, or the Communist Party as it was then renamed, in the capital in Moscow. He was the party secretary there. He was a loyal Stalinist, and when the Great Purges began in the late 1930s, he played just as much a part in them as any other of Stalin's loyal comrades. He purged comrades within the Moscow party organization, and he was sent to Ukraine by Stalin to purge his colleagues in the party there as well. Khrushchev knew that he had been just as complicit in Stalin's crimes as all the other leading Bolsheviks of the time. During the Second World War, he was a political commissar during the Second World War. He was political commissar in the Red Army, and he fought at Stalingrad. In fact, he was the only member of the collective leadership after Stalin that had those kind of close ties to the army. And as I mentioned a minute ago, he had a close relationship with General Zhukov, the hero of the Second World War, and the commander-in-chief of the Red Army. And then after that, he was promoted into the Politburo and was close to Stalin, but perhaps not the most outstanding member of the Politburo, and not the person who you would perhaps have, put your money on to be the next leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin died. However, by the time he became leader of the Soviet Union, he had embarked on a program of what's become known as de-Stalinization of the country. He wanted a new economic policy for the country, a new economic direction for the country. He wanted a new foreign policy for the country. And one of the main purposes for him of the program of de-Stalinization was to try and absolve himself of the guilt that he had of partaking in Stalin's purges in the 1930s. But did his new direction really change the country that much? It's questionable whether the degree to which he really wanted to create a new liberal Soviet Union. He was still a committed Marxist-Leninist. He just thought that Stalin had perverted the course of Marxism-Leninism. But he was no less a communist. He still wanted to make sure that the communist system remained intact. He did release thousands of political prisoners from the gulags. There were no purges in the Khrushchev period. There was some lifting of censorship. For example, the novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn was allowed to be published, his account of life in the Gulag. And there was some relaxation of policy towards the West in terms of the Cold War that had emerged after the Second World War as well. For example, the Korean War was brought to an end in 1953, and he met with the US President Eisenhower in Geneva in 1955, the first time that the leadership of the USA and the Soviet Union had met since the Potsdam Conference in 1945. But all of these kind of liberalizing measures only really went so far. And in terms of foreign policy, which we talk about more when we study the Cold War in Unit 3, in terms of foreign policy, the way the Soviet Union dealt with an uprising against communist rule in Hungary shows that really clearly. And the Soviet Union didn't become a completely liberal society where anyone could say or publish whatever they wanted. The Communist Party retained sole control, was the only legal political party. And although thousands of people were let out of the prison camps camp system still existed. The police still existed and were rebranded once again, or renamed once again, as the KGB. In terms of economic policy, Khrushchev admitted or realized that in terms of agriculture, that the policy of collectivization hadn't worked. And that the Soviet Union still wasn't producing enough grain, wasn't producing enough food, and still wasn't producing enough meat. And that they still weren't producing as much as they'd produced even before the First World War. However, he wasn't prepared to end the policy of collectivization. He claimed to be a bit of an expert in agricultural affairs because he came from a peasant background. And he thought that the way to deal with the problems of agriculture was to give more incentives to the peasants rather than to use brutal, coercive methods that had been used in the Stalin period. He thought it was necessary to incentivize the peasants. So he reduced the taxes that they had to pay. He increased the prices for the goods, the agricultural goods that the government bought from the peasantry. He allowed peasants to have bigger private plots in which they could grow their own vegetables and raise their own animals to sell on the private market. He allowed a degree of the private market. There are some similarities here with what Lenin had done with the new economic policy in the early 1920s. And famously, his kind of landmark or his signature agricultural policy was the Virgin Land Scheme. This was a scheme to cultivate areas of the Soviet Union that hadn't been cultivated before, primarily in Kazakhstan and southern Siberia. And to use more of the land to try and produce more crops and try and produce more food. And there were some successes in this. Between 1953 and 1958, there were big increases in the amount of grain produced, and in the amount of food grown, and in the amount of meat produced in the Soviet Union as well. But this was a temporary phenomenon, and it didn't last into the 1960s. For example, in 1962, the Soviet Union needed to import grain from the United States and from Australia in order to avert a famine. Khrushchev also had a bit of a kind of obsession with growing maize. He visited the United States in 1959, the first Soviet leaders to do so. And when he was there, he toured around a lot of American farms, and he was shown fields growing maize, and he thought that that the Soviet Union should do this as well. So he was obsessed and instructed regional sort of farm managers to grow maize everywhere, but it wasn't a suitable crop for the new virgin lands that were being cultivated, and lots of the crops failed. So there was some success, some sort of successes in terms of agricultural policy in the late 50s, but Khrushchev, like everyone before him really, still hadn't been able to solve the agricultural question in the Soviet Union. In terms of industry, he thought that there should be a less of an emphasis on heavy industrial goods, less of an emphasis on oil and steel and coal and all those kinds of things, and more of an emphasis on producing the kinds of things that the Soviet people wanted. More of an emphasis on producing consumer goods, on producing things, for the people. There should be a production of more fridges, for example, more cars, more televisions, things like this. He also thought that the industrial economy had become too centralized and too dominated by central government ministries, and had become too bureaucratic. So he wanted to reduce the power of central government bureaucracies and devolve power to regional economic councils, so that decisions could be made locally by local people with a greater knowledge of the local conditions. But he didn't move away from, having said that, he didn't move away from central government planning. Gosplan still existed. Vyshenka, the Supreme Economic Council, still existed. And there was a sixth five-year plan that was implemented in 1955. However, that was scrapped in 1959 when it was realised that the targets it set had been far too optimistic. And a 7-year plan was brought in 1959. And in that, there was more emphasis on consumer goods, on light industry, on producing chemicals, on producing plastics, and things like this. There were a lot of successes of the Khrushchev industrial policy. There were increases in consumer goods. There was a massive increase in the amount of housing that was available for citizens in the Soviet Union, and that dealt with chronic problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation that had occurred since the 1930s, with the mass movement of people from the countryside to urban centres. There were more consumer goods available, like cars, like TVs, like fridges, those kinds of things. However, there were still food shortages, and many shops within the Soviet Union still had huge queues outside of them. and there just wasn't enough, there just wasn't a properly functioning market for food for the average Soviet citizen. There was also a problem with quality. Although there might have been a lot more consumer goods being produced, they were of notoriously poor quality. The housing, for example, was built very quickly and was of poor quality, and was called was likened to new slum-like housing. In fact, the Russian word for slum is something like trushkoby, and the new housing built in the Khrushchev area was nicknamed Khrushkoby, Khrushchev's slums. However, the Soviet Union famously did start to overtake the United States in the late 1950s. Famously, the Soviets were the first person to put a satellite into space. They were the first person to put a man into space. They made enormous advances in terms of weapons technology and the space race. And there was genuine enthusiasm and optimism in the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union might be able to overtake the West. And in fact, there was genuine anxiety and genuine fear in the United States that they were being overtaken by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had put a man into space before they did, had put a satellite into space before they did. And it was those things that prompted the Americans to set up NASA. And to invest a lot more in engineering and scientific education in the late 1950s. However, by the end of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, that kind of growth spurt was over, and problems were emerging within the Soviet economy. Those problems, plus foreign policy mistakes of Khrushchev, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, seriously undermined his authority and seriously dented his prestige. And by the early 1960s, some of his colleagues in the Politburo were beginning to have their doubts about Khrushchev. By 1964, the Politburo ganged up against him and voted him out of office in 1964. However, he was the first leader of Russia or the Soviet Union to be voted out of office. All the other leaders had either died or been killed. All the czars from Alexander II and all of the leaders of the Communist Party had either been murdered or killed whilst in office. And it was kind of symbolic of Khrushchev's time in office that he was peacefully voted out of office, and he was given a pension, and he was given a country house, and he lived the last 7 years of his life between 1964 and 1971 in quiet retirement away from the public eye. While Khrushchev was in power, life for the average Soviet citizen undoubtedly improved. There were more consumer goods available. The fear that had been such an omnipresent feature of the Stalin years was taken away. Society was liberalized, and things did get better for many in the Soviet Union. However, the essentials of the Soviet system that had been established under Lenin and under Stalin stayed in place. The Communist Party was still the only source of political power. There was limited freedom of speech and freedom of publication. There were severe limits to the liberalization that occurred in the Soviet Union. There was still strict central planning of the economy, of agriculture and of industry. And there was still an insistence that the Bolshevik Party knew better than anyone, and that the Bolshevik Party was driving the Soviet Union onto the inevitable goal of the workers' utopia of communist society. As we know, that never happened. However, Khrushchev was said to be a major influence on Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, in 1985. And it was Gorbachev, who you may know, who embarked on lots of reforms in the late 1980s to try and liberalize the Soviet Union. His famous policies of glasnost and perestroika, meaning openness and reform. But it was Gorbachev's policies in the late 1980s that and the strains of the Cold War that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But arguably, Gorbachev in fact admitted to being inspired by Khrushchev and his reforms of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Between Khrushchev and Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was led by a man called Leonid Brezhnev between 1964 and 1982, and then briefly in 83 and 84 by two men, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. And broadly speaking, those were years of stagnation for the Soviet Union, of political conservatism and stagnation. And it was that stagnation and conservatism that Gorbachev wanted to address in the late 1980s. Anyway, that ends our sort of brief overview tour of Russian history from 1855 to 1964.